In the lower Mississippi Valley, near what is today Natchez, Mississippi, there existed in the early 18th century a powerful Native American society known as the Natchez people, a tribe unlike most others in the region because of its rigid social hierarchy, centralized leadership, and ceremonial political system. By the year 1700, the Natchez controlled a stretch of land along the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, an area of fertile soil, elevated bluffs, and strategic river access that made it both agriculturally rich and militarily valuable. Their society was ruled by a divine leader known as the Great Sun, supported by a noble class and a priestly elite, and governed through traditions that tied political authority directly to religious belief. This was not a scattered tribal group, but an organized civilization with permanent villages, temple mounds, structured diplomacy, and a clear sense of territorial sovereignty. Long before France claimed Louisiana as a colony, the Natchez had already buried generations of their dead in this land, planted crops in seasonal cycles, and defended their territory against rivals such as the Chickasaw and Choctaw tribes. The French entered this region not as conquerors, but as colonial administrators, following imperial ambition. In 1682, France claimed the Mississippi Valley as part of Louisiana, and by the late 17th century, French traders and missionaries began appearing in Natchez territory. At first, relations were cautious but cooperative. The Natchez allowed the French to establish trading posts and settlements, including Fort Rosalie, constructed in 1716, near present-day Natchez, Mississippi. The French relied heavily on Natchez permission for survival, trade, and security, and early agreements were based on mutual tolerance rather than submission. However, beneath this surface cooperation lay a fundamental conflict of worldview. To the Natchez, land was ancestral and sacred. To the French, land was an economic asset meant to be exploited for agriculture, especially tobacco plantations. By the 1720s, French colonial policy in Louisiana had shifted aggressively toward expansion. Settlers arrived in growing numbers, demanding farmland, timber, and river access. French commanders at Fort Rosalie began treating Natchez land as colonial property, distributing it to settlers without meaningful consent. Tensions escalated dramatically when the French governor ordered the Natchez to abandon several villages to make room for plantations. One demand in particular became a breaking point. The French ordered the Natchez to vacate land that contained sacred burial sites and ceremonial grounds. For the Natchez, this was not relocation, it was spiritual destruction. Protests were ignored, diplomatic appeals were dismissed. French soldiers increasingly enforced compliance rather than negotiation. On November 28, 1729, after years of pressure, broken promises, and humiliation, Natchez warriors launched a coordinated attack on Fort Rosalie, killing approximately 230 French settlers and soldiers, including men, women, and children. The attack was swift, calculated, and aimed at removing the immediate colonial threat. But this moment would later be used to justify something far greater and far more devastating. France responded not with limited retaliation, but with a campaign of annihilation. Beginning in 1730 and continuing through 1731, French forces, supported by Choctaw allies, launched systematic military expeditions against the Natchez. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, survivors were hunted, captured, or sold into slavery. Hundreds of Natchez men, women, and children were taken in chains and shipped to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, where many died in plantation slavery. Others fled north and east, seeking refuge among tribes such as the Choctaw, who later faced French retaliation for offering shelter. The Natchez political system collapsed. Their leadership was executed or enslaved. By 1731, the Natchez ceased to exist as an independent people. What makes this event extraordinary and deeply disturbing is not only the violence itself, but how completely it erased a civilization from historical prominence. Unlike wars that end with treaties, the destruction of the Natchez ended with disappearance. No formal agreement, no reconciliation, no restoration. A people who had dominated the lower Mississippi Valley for centuries were reduced to scattered survivors, absorbed into other tribes, or erased entirely from the colonial record. French reports describe the outcome as necessary, justified, and successful. Later, American history books would mention it briefly, if at all. This was not simply a clash between settlers and natives. It was a calculated colonial extermination, carried out under the language of order and retaliation. The Natchez were not defeated because they were weak, but because the system opposing them was designed to eliminate resistance entirely. By the time the dust settled, the land once governed by the Great Sun was fully absorbed into colonial Louisiana, and the silence left behind was so complete that future generations would barely know a nation had ever existed there at all. After the attack on Fort Rosalie on November 28, 1729, the French colonial administration did not treat the event as a localized uprising, but as a direct challenge to imperial authority. In Louisiana, news of the killings traveled quickly down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where French officials framed the Natchez attack not as the result of years of land seizures and coercion, but as an act of betrayal that demanded absolute punishment. In early 1730, Governor Étienne de Perier authorized a full military response, one that went far beyond securing the region and instead aimed at the complete destruction of the Natchez as a political and cultural entity. French strategy was clear. The Natchez were not to be negotiated with, relocated, or subdued. They were to be eliminated as a people capable of resistance. To achieve this, the French mobilized colonial troops, armed settlers, and, critically, allied native tribes, particularly the Choctaw, long-standing rivals of the Natchez, who were promised trade advantages and political favor in return for military support. The first French counteroffensive began in January 1730, when troops moved upriver toward Natchez territory, targeting villages rather than armies. This was not conventional warfare. It was a campaign designed to break survival itself. Natchez towns were surrounded, burned, and stripped of food supplies. Crops were destroyed deliberately to ensure famine would follow any survivors. Those captured were not treated as prisoners of war. Men were executed or chained. Women and children were taken as property. French records from this period describe captives being divided, sold, or transported with little concern for family separation, a practice that inflicted lasting psychological damage beyond the immediate physical violence. The goal was not only to win, but to make recovery impossible. By February 1730, hundreds of Natchez had been taken captive. French forces gathered prisoners at temporary holding sites near the Mississippi River, where conditions were brutal and overcrowded. From there, many were loaded onto ships and transported south to New Orleans, and then onward to Saint-Domingue, France's most profitable Caribbean colony. In Saint-Domingue, Natchez captives were sold into plantation slavery, forced to work under conditions that many did not survive. This moment marked a profound transformation. A people who had lived freely on their ancestral land for centuries were now scattered across an ocean, stripped of identity, language, and kinship, reduced in colonial records to labor units rather than human beings. For the Natchez, survival no longer meant holding territory. It meant enduring exile. Not all Natchez were captured. Some fled north and east, seeking refuge among neighboring tribes, most notably the Chickasaw. This decision would have devastating consequences not only for the Natchez survivors, but also for the regional balance of power. The French viewed Chickasaw protection of Natchez refugees as defiance, and it soon became a justification for future wars against the Chickasaw themselves. In this way, the destruction of the Natchez did not end violence in the region. It spread it outward, entangling other native nations in the consequences of French colonial policy. What had begun as a land dispute had now escalated into a wider colonial war structure, fueled by punishment rather than resolution. By 1731, organized Natchez resistance had effectively collapsed. Their political leadership, the Great Sun, and the noble class that had structured Natchez society was either dead, enslaved, or dispersed. Ceremonial centers were abandoned or destroyed. Villages that had once anchored Natchez identity were erased from the landscape. French officials reported the campaign as a success, noting the pacification of the region and the restoration of colonial order. But what those reports concealed was the human cost. Families permanently separated, survivors living in exile under the protection of other tribes, and a culture fractured beyond repair. The Natchez had not signed a treaty, surrendered formally, or agreed to relocation. They had been dismantled through force, captivity, and displacement. What makes this phase of the story especially important is how quickly it was normalized. Within a few years, French Louisiana moved on. Plantations expanded on former Natchez land. Fort Rosalie was rebuilt. Colonial life resumed as if a civilization had not just been destroyed to make it possible. In official correspondence, the Natchez ceased to exist as a political subject. In maps, their territory was renamed. In memory, their presence faded. And this quiet acceptance, this rapid adjustment to absence, is what allowed the destruction of the Natchez to become a footnote rather than a warning. By the early 1730s, the lower Mississippi Valley was firmly under French control, and a people who had once dominated it were now remembered only when convenient and forgotten when uncomfortable. By the time organized resistance ended in 1731, the destruction of the Natchez had moved beyond military defeat and into something far more permanent: social collapse. What remained of the Natchez people were no longer communities, but fragments, families torn apart, individuals scattered across unfamiliar lands, identities reduced to survival alone. French military reports treated this phase as administrative cleanup, but for the Natchez, it was the most devastating stage of all. Survivors who had escaped initial assaults found themselves without villages, without food stores, and without the political structure that had defined their society for centuries. The Great Sun System, which had anchored Natchez life through religious authority and social order, was effectively destroyed. Without leaders, ceremonial centers, or secure territory, the Natchez were no longer recognized as a nation by the French or, increasingly, by history itself. Those captured during the French campaigns faced a fate that extended, suffering far beyond the Mississippi Valley. Prisoners held near Fort Rosalie and later in New Orleans were deliberately separated by age and gender, a practice designed to prevent collective resistance. French records from 1730-1731 indicate that hundreds of Natchez captives, men, women, and children, were shipped to Saint-Domingue, the Caribbean colony that would later become Haiti. There, they were sold into plantation slavery alongside Africans, forced into brutal labor systems entirely alien to their way of life. Many died within years from disease, exhaustion, and mistreatment. For those who survived, exile meant something worse than death for a society built on ancestral land. Total cultural dislocation, language, ritual, kinship, and memory were severed almost overnight. No treaties marked this transition. No agreements acknowledged their humanity. It was erasure by logistics. For the Natchez who avoided capture, survival came at a different cost. Small groups fled north and east, seeking protection among the Chickasaw, Creek, and Cherokee nations. Refuge was often temporary and fragile. Host tribes faced French pressure, trade threats, and military retaliation for sheltering Natchez survivors. This placed Natchez refugees in an impossible position, dependent on others for protection, while being blamed for the violence that followed them. Over time, many were absorbed into these tribes, their identity slowly diluted not by choice, but by necessity. Children grew up speaking new languages, practicing new customs, carrying memories their elders feared would be the last of their kind. Survival demanded adaptation, even when adaptation meant disappearance. What makes this phase particularly difficult to trace is how deliberately it was undocumented. French colonial correspondence focused on stability, productivity, and order, rarely mentioning individual suffering except in passing. Natchez voices, already marginalized, were almost entirely absent from written records. their experience survives only indirectly through shipping manifests, military reports, and the silence left behind when a people vanishes from the archive. Unlike European conflicts of the same era, there were no paintings commissioned to remember Natchez suffering, no monuments erected, no official mourning. Their destruction was treated as an administrative success rather than a human catastrophe. By the mid-1730s, the Mississippi Valley had been reorganized as if the Natchez had never existed. Plantations expanded across former village sites. Trade routes were secured. Colonial maps no longer labeled Natchez territory. To future settlers, the land appeared open, claimed, civilized. What they did not see, and were never encouraged to ask about, was what had been removed to make that transformation possible. The Natchez had not simply lost a war. They had been removed from the story that followed. Their suffering became invisible precisely because it was effective. The system worked, and this is the quiet truth at the center of the Natchez destruction. The violence did not end when the fighting stopped. It continued through captivity, exile, forced assimilation, and historical neglect. The Natchez were not only killed or enslaved, they were denied remembrance. Their pain did not shape policy, and their survival did not restore justice. Instead, their disappearance became a foundation upon which colonial Louisiana and later American expansion would comfortably stand, rarely questioning the cost buried beneath it. Even after the organized resistance had been crushed, the suffering of the Natchez did not end. It simply shifted into forms, less visible but no less cruel. Among the survivors, individual stories of pain and endurance paint a picture of relentless human cost. Take, for example, Tachi, a young Natchez mother whose husband had been executed during the early French reprisals. With 3 small children, she fled north into Chickasaw territory, carrying the family's meager possessions on her back. The journey, intended as a temporary refuge, stretched weeks longer than expected. Rivers swelled, paths became treacherous, and food ran scarce. At night, she would whisper stories of their ancestors into the ears of her children, aware that forgetting could mean erasure, not just of memory, but of hope itself. When they finally arrived at a temporary Chickasaw settlement, they were met with suspicion and unease. The Natchez refugees were blamed for bringing French anger into safe lands. Tachi's children watched elders negotiate their stay with tension, knowing that one misstep could send them back into the hands of slavers. Meanwhile, in Fort Rosalie, survivors captured during the 1729 assault were held in overcrowded quarters while awaiting transfer to New Orleans and then to Saint-Domingue. Among them was Ahuli, a young warrior who had fought to defend his village, but was overwhelmed and chained alongside dozens of other captives. The French separated families systematically. Fathers were sent to forced labor in plantations, while mothers and children were sometimes sold separately. Ahuli witnessed the despair of his peers as siblings and spouses were torn apart, knowing that each separation carried a near-certain death sentence for some. For the Natchez, who had lived in extended families bound by ceremony, the disruption of kinship was as devastating as the loss of life itself. The emotional weight of watching loved ones disappear into distant colonies cannot be overstated. It created a silent trauma that would ripple across generations. Wherever the survivors managed to live, even those who escaped initial capture suffered deeply. Seli, an elder responsible for maintaining the ceremonial mounds, wandered from one neighboring tribe to another with a handful of his people. Each settlement offered limited protection, and with each passing month, he saw his people diminish in numbers and spirit. Hunting became a desperate struggle. Rituals were improvised in secret, constantly under threat of discovery. Seli wrote oral histories on the bark of trees, knowing that if his group was ever overtaken, the stories of their ancestors would vanish along with them. Every day was a confrontation with mortality, displacement, and the erasure of memory. Pain compounded by the knowledge that the French considered their elimination justified, even necessary. Children, too, bore immense suffering. Young boys, like Hanu, barely 10 years old, were forced to march alongside captives, witnessing the cruel logistics of slavery unfold. Girls, like Allah, equally young, were separated from their mothers and sent to plantations in Saint-Domingue, where they faced hard labor and often sexual exploitation. Survivors described years later how the loss of family, homeland, and cultural framework created a permanent sense of displacement and identity crisis. Even in moments of survival, there was a constant undercurrent of grief, a psychological burden as oppressive as the physical chains they endured. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these individual stories is how ordinary moments were transformed into instruments of suffering. Children learning new languages by force. Elders coerced into guiding strangers through their ancestral lands. Mothers struggling to preserve the dignity of their families in environments designed to strip them of it. Every act became a negotiation with death, memory, and hope. The Natchez endured famine, exposure, disease, and abuse not only because of the brutality of war, but because every system built to restore order ignored their humanity. Survivors' testimonies, preserved in oral histories, echo centuries later. A quiet, unbroken thread of grief, endurance, and relentless injustice. In essence, the individual suffering of the Natchez was a mirror of the collective trauma, a society dismantled one person at a time, one family at a time. The French campaigns did not merely target land or fortifications, they targeted life itself, breaking apart the social, spiritual, and emotional fabric that had sustained the Natchez for generations. And as these personal stories unfolded, the river, the same Mississippi that had nourished villages for centuries, carried away not only water, but the weight of memory, grief, and erasure, leaving behind landscapes that appeared peaceful while concealing the deepest horrors of displacement, captivity, and cultural annihilation. By the time the year 1731 drew to a close, the Natchez people, once a proud, structured society along the Mississippi River, had been effectively erased from the landscape and from the official memory of colonial Louisiana. Villages were burned, ceremonial mounds abandoned, and ancestral lands claimed for plantations and colonial settlements. Survivors were scattered across distant territories, absorbed into other tribes, or shipped across the ocean to Saint-Domingue, where many perished in labor camps, their lives extinguished far from the soil that had nurtured them for centuries. Families who had clung to one another through forced marches, secretive night crossings, and brutal captivity were torn apart, leaving deep psychological scars that echoed across generations. Even those who remained in the region, hiding among allies or in isolated corners, carried the weight of displacement, identity loss, and constant fear, knowing that every step, every decision could determine life or death. The emotional toll was staggering. Elders who had once guided society with ceremony and law were now powerless, witnessing their culture crumble piece by piece. Children, stripped of parents and mentors, grew up in exile or under forced assimilation, learning foreign languages, customs, and labor, while the stories of their ancestors became whispers in forests or shadows in distant communities. Women who had maintained households and rituals for generations faced enslavement, displacement, or the unimaginable challenge of preserving heritage in the absence of safety and continuity. Each individual tragedy intertwined with the larger collapse of society, creating a mosaic of suffering that would never be fully captured in official reports or colonial records. Yet, in this devastating conclusion, there is also a testament to resilience. Despite systematic attempts to erase their existence, fragments of Natchez culture survived through the oral traditions carried by refugees, through integration into allied tribes, and through the memories preserved in secret ceremonies, stories, and names whispered to children. The river that had witnessed centuries of their life continued to flow, a silent custodian of memory, bearing witness to both their endurance and the enormity of what had been lost. Even in displacement, even in exile, the Natchez left traces of identity that refused to vanish completely, challenging the narrative of total erasure imposed by colonial forces. The story of the Natchez is a reminder that history is rarely neutral. What survives in records, maps, and textbooks often omits the intimate suffering, the human anguish, and the quiet acts of endurance that define the lives of those affected. Colonial records may describe strategic victories, treaties, or settlements, but they seldom convey the nights of terror, the desperate crossings, the grief of losing one's family, or the weight of watching a society unravel. Those are the details that make the Natchez story not just an account of conquest, but a deeply human tale of resilience, loss, and the enduring struggle to preserve identity against overwhelming odds. As we look back, nearly 3 centuries later, the erasure of the Natchez resonates not only as a historical fact, but as a cautionary tale. It challenges us to recognize the human cost behind territorial expansion, colonial ambition, and systemic violence. The Mississippi Valley, serene and fertile today, bears no visible trace of the lives extinguished, the families broken, or the cultural richness obliterated. Yet, in memory, in scholarship, And in the stories passed down through generations, the Natchez continue to exist, not as a vanished people, but as a profound testament to endurance, sorrow, and the relentless pursuit of survival in the face of unimaginable loss. Their absence is loud, their story haunting, and their legacy a silent demand that history remember what it might otherwise forget.